Hello, hello. It is week 14 of 15. Yikes. We are spending our last few days before our Thanksgiving week long break fulfilling student stars and wishes. And today was a combination of two different requests from students. One, to talk about the stuff in tabletop role playing games, and another, to think about digital tools, virtual tabletops, other kinds of tools, all kinds of things. And appropriately enough, it turned out to be the day that Candela Obscura was coming out in its rulebook form, and Demiplane was rolling out its digital tool set, the first time that it had ever rolled out a digital tool set on the day of a game's release. So we had the chance to, thanks to Josh Simons of Demiplane, take a look at those digital tools along with the digital tools for the Avatar RPG. And so we spent the end of class looking at those different character creators, thinking about their user interfaces and designs, the ways that they onboard players, the knowledge that each of them assumes that the player has. In the case of Candela, it presumes no knowledge because how would you know anything about the lore of the world of New Fair? Uh, at this point in its development. On the other hand, of course, Avatar is based on a long-standing IP, one that is students in my class voted on in order to take a look at because they were deeply attached to it. I was kind of the odd man out going, wow, this requires a lot of knowledge of things I don't actually know in order to fill out. Nevertheless, we took a look at the way it was arranged and played around with it in interesting kinds of ways. It's always fun to ask students to break a system. One student said, I copy and pasted the entire Wikipedia entry for Roll20 three times into one form to see what would happen. It didn't blow up, although it did only show one line of that text. So fascinating kind of usability testing. And that's where we ended class. But to build up to that, we first started talking about what happens on analog tabletops. And one of the interesting things about talking about materiality as a specific focus this late in the semester is, oh, right, we haven't talked about Dungeons and Dragons very much in this class, only in passing. So we haven't really talked about many games that use battle maps, which is to say, specific grid layouts that are broken off in 5-foot segments and why you might need that. In other words, combat. Haven't really talked about combat in this class, which is either a really great overlooking on my part or a really great overlooking on my part. Reasonable people can disagree. And so this was an opportunity for the students who'd played Pathfinder and D&D and other games that do require the use of battle maps to explain what battle maps are for, which is to figure out your range, your relative position in relationship to monsters, as well as your allies, all those sorts of things, which then extended out to a discussion of miniatures, a thing I actually don't own and probably should have borrowed some from my own dungeon master. I mean, I do own one, thanks to John Boltena, I should note, but that one's precious and I didn't want to bring it to class. I did, however, bring some of the other material objects that we use in a D&D campaign that are can also be understood as hacks to the system in some cases. For example, I have a whole bunch of these inspiration tokens from world builders that take the notion of inspiration from a simple roll with advantage at some point, which my table inspiration could be granted in a different kind of way. And that's a hack to the system. That's not just a material fun object. That's a transformation of the mechanics of the game if you're using it. In a similar fashion, Dungeons and Daddy's Deck of Daddy Things, which does indeed credit Wizards of the Coast, but is a transformation of the Deck of Many Things into dad flavored things like Dad Bod or Call Your Mother and other kinds of effects, is another way that a material object has been can be kind of imagined entirely in theater of the mind. Hold on to that for just a second, but also can be made into a tangible and indeed quite lovely object. And of course, Wizards of the Coast is sending a copy of the Deck of Many Things in the not too distant future. But as we talked about, one of the reasons why it hasn't arrived is because material objects come with a certain amount of risk as it relates to production. The current Deck of Many Things is not yet available for sale and has missed its publication date, in part because there was a snafu in the production. There was a desire to make it more eco friendly, so they eschewed plastic wrap on the deck, which meant that the decks got damaged and bent. Oops. And this is the challenge of tabletop role playing games. You have to have a pretty kind of big operation to deal in material objects, including even printing your rules themselves. I mean, this is one of the things that we have talked about a not insignificant amount is the different kind of costs of PDFs versus printing, which is to say that the baseline labor doesn't necessarily kind of get enormously smaller when you're talking about the difference between PDF and printed book. There's still an enormous amount of writing labor and design labor and all those sorts of things that's true either way. But there have been rising costs of paper and printing and shipping. And those things do start to add up and mean that putting a game out into the world in physical form is a particular kind of risk. We'll be talking more about that when Taylor Moore comes by and we talk about Kickstarter and his experience, kind of working for that platform, and probably when we talk to Maggie Baker on Thursday, as we talk about the ways in which, her long experience in game design and game publishing has worked out. And it is not all D&D today. One of the other things I pulled was Dwelling, which is a solo game for ghosts, that you would think, "Oh, it's just a book," and it's not a huge book, but it's got this cool keyhole mechanic that you use in concert with the book that makes the physical object meaningful and interactive, in ways that you can replicate with a print on demand PDF, but something beautiful about tangibility. And this is something that we talked about is that the pleasures of the physical are very real in this kind of way. And there's something lovely about having dice to call your own, and that we can't kind of undersell the ways in which physical stuff matters. And to show the most extreme version, I pulled up the game dnd.com, which is the longest running continuous campaign of Dungeons and Dragons known to at least anybody. No one else has come for the claim of older than 1982 and still going. And what's really fascinating about the game is that in the 1990s, the game moved to a permanent location in the Dungeon Master's home, which means increasingly elaborate set pieces and battle maps, things that even Matt Mercer can only envy. Soaring trees and multiple ships and all kinds of stuff. A hall of heroes of the miniatures who have represent characters that have died in the multi-generational campaign that's been running since the earliest edition of D&D, and basically has taken its own evolutionary pathway. And I showed images from the game to talk about, okay, so what do you have to have in order to facilitate this, right? You have to have space to store this stuff. You have to have time to paint and craft it. In other words, you have to have leisure and you have to have money in some kind of ratio. And so not everybody can play this kind of way. And of course, since 2020, especially, we've had more and more remote games, which is then how we get to remote tools. We started with a look at Roll20 because Roll20 is designed for the use of kind of combat, right? You've got the fog of war, which we had to describe, see everything, but you want to also make sure that when the players are looking at it, they can't actually see everything. When we're playing in person, we might not put out those minis right away, or we might cover parts of the map with paper, and you have to do a version of that when you're playing with a virtual tabletop that is designed with the grid on it for that kind of combat. But as we discussed, there was an alternative. That word I mentioned earlier, or phrase, theater of the mind. And so theater of the mind is differently immersive. Students were talking about the immersion that came from these tangible objects or these highly detailed maps. But it's possible to be immersive without having any of that kind of stuff. But it's different kind of stuff. And so we looked at Sirenscape and we looked at Alchemy, these systems or these kind of tool sets that are designed either to give you sound in the case of Sirenscape, or in the case of Alchemy, sound and image and kind of mood in terms of the user interface, where you have also have a kind of Zoom like ability to see your fellow players if you so choose. And so that's not designed for grid based combat. That's entirely designed for theater of the mind, and yet is a kind of making a claim to be a robust digital tool set, just of a different set of tools. And so then we turned to those character sheets, to those character creation engines, Dungeon D&D Beyond, which started here in Alabama originally and is now owned by Wizards of the Coast, is the way for onboarding, players into D&D. Now, it is not the first, and it is not the only such character creator for D&D. It just happens to be the one that now has the might of Wizards of the Coast behind it, and with all the things that that adds as a value add, and all of the things that some people don't see as necessarily useful features. If you're not playing the most recent edition of Dungeons& and Dragons, it might not actually be useful for you to play with D&D Beyond, for example. And Demiplane, which Josh Simons had come and visited much earlier in the semester, is trying to do that for many other games, including the World of Darkness, including Avatar, and of course, most recently, including Candela Obscura. I gave students about 10 minutes to try to create as much of a character as they could, encouraging them to try to break the system in some way, shape, or form. And what was really useful about students focusing primarily on Avatar and Candela is we've gone over a little bit of Candela's character sheet in the quick start guide, but we haven't literally been able to read most of the rules for Candela. They came out today, and I've had my personal copy for maybe a week, and that didn't come with a PDF that I could share with students, um, which would be very appreciated. Anyway, the point is that we got a good example of onboarding players who have no experience with the rules whatsoever, even if they do happen to have some experience with lore in some way, shape, or form. And indeed, both of these setups were praised for the ways in which they streamline the information, and we talked about the ways in which these are also aesthetic objects, designed in order to communicate something about the feel of the games as well. One of the things that was quite interesting was to talk about the ways in which this is all information that's in the book. Most people would normally and easily play with a paper character sheet and a copy of the book. This transforms that information, which also transforms the ways in which costing works, in which kind of speed of play can work, all of these sorts of things. So, we spent a lot of today talking about those different kinds of what we think of as affordances. In other words, the ways in which the particular design choices, either for physical objects or for digital environments, tool sets, and the like, allow us to do certain kinds of things more easily, and other kinds of things have friction. It was harder for me to find lore material on Demiplane than it is for me when I just crack open the book version of Candela. On the other hand, navigating and creating a character is often a pain in a physical book, depending on how it's laid out, finding the different options. My copy of the D&D Player's Handbook is testimony to the number of tabs it is useful to have when helping a whole bunch of players make characters across different classes and races and all of the assorted folderol, right? And as I noted to students, one of the important things to think about is the digital becomes more and more valuable the more complex and the more extensive a game becomes. And that can have a